that mighty soul-shaking voice that carried songs like Love Train, Backstabbers, and For the Love of Money straight into history. For more than 60 years, his voice wasn't just something you heard with your ears. It was something you felt deep in your bones. It was the sound of joy, of pride, of hope for so many people. He came from the humblest beginnings, from the little churches in Alabama to the biggest stages in the world. He climbed from a life of struggle to a life of glory, turning his pain into beautiful music and his sadness into song. Eddie Levert is more than a legend. He is a living, breathing piece of music history, a monument to strength, faith, and the heavy price that sometimes comes with being great. But behind the legend, a storm was always brewing. The man who used his voice to lift millions of people has had to bury 3 of his own children. And now, at 83 years old, this giant, this titan of music who once made the whole world dance with joy, stands in a haunting silence, facing shadows and memories that only his own heart can understand. When the bright lights fade away and the music finally stops, can the man who taught the world how to love still find peace inside his own heart? Before we go any further, if you believe in honoring a legacy, press that like button and leave a little heart in the comments. It's a simple act of love and respect for a true soul warrior, a man who is still singing, even through the storm. It is a cruel and strange thing that some of the most beautiful voices in the world must first learn how to cry before they can learn how to sing. Some souls are shaped in silence and molded by hunger. Every great legend seems to start with a deep wound. And Eddie Levert's story began with the red clay and the tired prayers of Alabama. He was a boy who felt unseen, but he was destined to be heard by the entire world. He was born on June 16, 1942, in Bessemer, Alabama. It was a town where the air was thick with dust from the steel mills, a place where dreams often grew rusty and died before they ever had a chance to shine. His father worked long, brutal shifts at the local mills. His mother scrubbed floors and washed the clothes of strangers until her hands were raw and cracked. For the family, faith was the only real thing they had. The Levert home was a small wooden house that leaked when it rained and groaned when the wind blew. On some nights, the kitchen echoed with a hollow sound, not because it was empty of people, but because it was empty of food. His mother would sometimes hand him the bigger half of a single slice of bread and whisper, "Eat, baby. I'm not hungry." He knew even as a child that she was lying, and that knowledge broke his heart more than the hunger pains in his own stomach. He didn't just grow up poor. He grew up feeling invisible, just one of millions of black children born into an America that had made them a promise it was not yet ready to keep. School was no escape from the hardship. Some of his classmates would laugh at his worn-out shoes. Others would tell him, "You'll never make it out of this place, they were so wrong." In the small Baptist church near his home, his mother would whisper to him, "Sing it like you mean it, Eddie." And he did. In that simple room, built of wood and filled with hope, his voice would rise up like a ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Every note was a prayer, and every prayer was an act of survival. Years later, he would remember, "I didn't know it then, but singing in that church was saving me from the crushing silence of being poor." When Eddie was just 6 years old, his parents made the most desperate and brave decision of their lives. They packed the little they owned into a tired, rattling truck and headed north to Canton, Ohio. They were chasing rumors of work and a little bit of mercy. This was part of the Great Migration, when millions of black families left the harshness of the Jim Crow South, hoping for a chance at a better life and a little dignity. The road was long and cold and uncertain. They slept in their truck at gas stations, shared what little food they had with strangers on the same journey, and prayed every single mile that the old truck would hold together for just one more mile. Canton was not the promised land they had dreamed of. The winters there were brutal and merciless. The little boy who used to run barefoot on the warm Alabama dirt now had to trudge through icy streets in torn shoes that let the cold seep right into his bones. His father's back became more and more bent under the heavy weight of factory labor. His mother's hands, already rough, now bled from cleaning the homes of other people. But still, every single Sunday, the family would go to church and sing. "The darker it gets," his father would tell him, "the brighter we must sound." That small, cold house in Canton became their own little chapel, built not of stone but of pure hope. Eddie sang to stay alive. He sang to keep warm. He sang because the silence of his life hurt more than the hunger in his belly. He would later say, "When you've got no heat in your house, you learn to make fire from your own breath." The church choir became his sanctuary, a small piece of heaven he found inside a life of hardship. His voice began to carry the weight of his people, his personal pain, and his most private prayers. By the time he was 15, music was no longer just a dream for Eddie. It was his lifeline, his rebellion, his reason for being. Poverty had tried its best to break him, but music gave him the strength to stand straight again. Out of his hunger came a rhythm. Out of the cold came soul. Out of his pain came a powerful purpose. He was one of those rare people who simply refused to let despair define who he was. Every rejection, every empty night just became fuel for his fire. He had no money, no safety net, and no certainty about the future. All he had was that voice. But for Eddie Levert, that was enough. The boy who once sang for his supper would one day earn more than $20 million with that very same voice. The voice that rose above poverty, above prejudice, and above pain. He learned that faith is not just the words you say on a Sunday. It is the song you sing when your stomach is empty. He proved that greatness does not come from what you own, but from what you have managed to survive. And from that voice, born from faith, fire, and sheer survival, grew a legacy that would lift the spirits of the world for generations. He was a boy who was never supposed to rise up. But he did. The hunger he felt as a child never really left him. It just changed its name. What once gnawed at his empty stomach now burned as a fire inside his chest. The boy who sang through his hunger had become a young man who was now chasing the sound of freedom. The walls of the church could no longer contain that powerful voice. It wanted to be out in the streets under the bright lights, heard by anyone and everyone who might believe in him. But dreams, just like rent, always have a due date. And faith, as beautiful as it is, cannot buy gasoline for a car. In the late 1950s, Canton, Ohio was still a town wrapped in cold dust and an even colder wind. The steel mills would scream to life at dawn, and hope was a luxury that most people simply could not afford. Eddie worked any job he could find. He swept factory floors, he loaded heavy boxes onto trucks, he cleaned tools for men who were twice his age. At night, he sang with his friends from school. They called themselves the Triumphs. Later, they changed their name to the Mascots. They practiced in garages that smelled of oil and rust, harmonizing under a single bare light bulb that flickered like a dying heartbeat. Their microphones were broomsticks, and their music was the only currency of value they had. Some nights, there wasn't enough money for dinner, just enough for a little gas. The boys would drive to their cheap gigs in a rust-red Chevy that coughed out more smoke than a tired old man. They sang for crowds that barely even looked at them, for pay that was so small it could barely buy a loaf of bread. When the show was over, they would curl up together in that same car, using their jackets as blankets, the cold night air slicing through the cracks in the doors. Eddie would wake up to the sound of the wind moaning across the fields, his stomach burning with hunger. He'd scrape the frost from the inside of the windshield with his numb fingers, whispering a quiet prayer that both the car's engine and his own dream would start one more time. We didn't have money for hotels, he would later recall with a weary smile. We had each other, and we had the headlights of that car to light our way. They laughed together to keep from crying, writing song lyrics on napkins and old gas station receipts. There were long nights when the only sound was the silence from the radio, broken only by the rumble of passing trucks and the echo of their own young voices. We sang, Eddie once said, to keep the cold away, to keep our spirits warm. When they finally saved enough to record a demo, they sent it to every record label they could find. Most of the letters they sent never came back. Some were returned to them, still unopened. Others came back with a note that felt as sharp as a knife. Too rough, the notes would say, or too southern, or simply too black. Eddie would carefully fold those rejection letters and keep them in his pocket. He did not keep them as a badge of shame, but as fuel for his fire. He told his friend Walter, "If they won't open their doors for us, then we will just have to build our own stage." Then, in 1961, a tiny crack of light finally appeared. King Records in Cincinnati offered them a small deal, just enough money to let them dream a little louder. They wore their best secondhand suits, drove all through the night, and sang in that studio as if their very lives depended on it. And in a way, maybe they did. They recorded a song called Lonely Drifter, a song about a man wandering through the world, feeling completely unseen and unheard. It was their own truth wrapped up in a melody. But when the record was finally released, almost no one played it. The world stayed silent. We waited by the radio, Eddie remembered. Our song never came. That silence finally broke them. Bobby left the group first, then Bill. "We'll be back when times get better," they promised. But the times never really did get better for them. Eddie watched as their silhouettes faded down the road, their laughter swallowed up by the wind. For the first time, the old car felt too big and the dream they shared felt too small. But Eddie stayed. Walter Williams stayed. William Powell stayed. They had nothing left but their faith and the broken rhythm of survival. "If all we have is each other," Eddie said, "then we've got a band." By the mid-1960s, they renamed themselves the OJs, as a tribute to a Cleveland radio DJ named Eddie OJ who had believed in them. But belief, no matter how strong, could not buy groceries. They hustled from one small bar to another, singing through clouds of cigarette smoke and the clinking of beer bottles, their voices growing raw but always staying honest. Some nights they sang for just 3 people. Other nights they sang only for the bartender who was wiping down the counter. Still, Eddie sang every note as if the entire world was listening. "Every rejection became a lyric in a new song," he said. "Every long mile on the road became a new verse." Then came a gig in Philadelphia, a real gamble, in a city known for its soul music and for giving people second chances. One night the lights in the club dimmed and Eddie closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's cracked hands, his father's bent back, the frost on those cold Ohio windows. When he opened his mouth to sing, what came out wasn't just music. It was everything he had ever survived. For a single heartbeat, the room was completely still. And then the applause came. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was thunderous, it was powerful, rising up like a storm, finally breaking open all those years of silence. Tears stung his eyes. It wasn't fame yet, but it was something holy. It was the first time in his life that hope sounded louder than hunger. He was not singing for fame. He was singing for survival. To prove to himself that poverty could not silence a person's purpose. And even though the world had turned its back on him for so long, his voice had refused to bow down. He had nothing left to prove to anyone, only something left to protect. The belief that no voice, no matter how poor, should ever go unheard. And so the boy who once sang for his supper became the man who taught the world that pain, when it is sung with honesty, can sound an awful lot like hope. The storm of his early life had passed, or so he thought. But sometimes what looks like calm is only the deep breath you take before destiny explodes. By the early 1970s, Eddie Levert was 30 years old, standing right on the edge of everything he had ever prayed for. The boy who once sang through hunger and rejection was about to become the voice of an entire generation. In 1972, when the OJs signed with Philadelphia International Records, the world finally heard what a lifetime of struggle had been teaching him all along. Backstabbers hit the airwaves like a lightning strike. Love Train turned into a worldwide anthem of unity, and For the Love of Money echoed through the streets as both a warning and a testimony. Within just 3 short years, the group sold over 10 million records. From sleeping in his car to commanding $100,000 for a single night's performance, Eddie had climbed from empty pockets to the global spotlight. "We never really dreamed of fame," he once said quietly. "We just wanted to be able to eat without worrying." And somehow the world had finally started to listen. But behind the roaring applause, there was an exhaustion that no one in the audience could see. Between 1973 and 1980, the OJs performed more than 200 shows every single year, crossing from city to city until time itself blurred into one long, loud sound. Tour buses became their bedrooms, hotel rooms became temporary hospitals. Eddie's voice, once as powerful as thunder, began to crack sometimes like glass from sheer overuse. "If I stopped singing," he told a reporter once, "I think I'd stop breathing." Some nights he would collapse backstage, too dizzy to stand, but too proud to ever stop the show. He would rest for just a few minutes, then walk back out under the hot lights, smiling for the crowd as if his pain was just another part of the performance. "People paid their hard-earned money to hear joy," he recalled. "They didn't come to see how tired we were." Fame, he learned, had its own kind of gravity. It was beautiful, but it could also be crushing. Every standing ovation was followed by a silence so deep that it hurt. "The crowds roared," he said, "but when the curtain finally fell, the quiet that followed hit me harder than any applause ever could." And even when they were at the peak of their success, the numbers on their bank statements didn't always add up. Their gold records lined the walls, but their bank accounts often told a harsher truth. Unpaid royalties and exploitative contracts, cost the group more than $400,000 between 1974 and 1976 alone. They sang to arenas packed with 20,000 screaming fans and still sometimes went home almost broke. "We sang our hearts out for the world," Eddie said. "But we were young and didn't always understand who really owned our voices." But the pain came in more forms than just financial numbers. In 1977, they lost William Powell, a true brother in sound and soul, to cancer. The harmony that had carried them for so long suddenly sounded different and much lonelier. Eddie never spoke much about that loss in public. Instead, he just sang harder, as if he was trying to keep his friend alive inside of every single note. Yet he kept going, writing new songs, producing records, fighting tirelessly to reclaim control over the music they had created. In 1978, burned out and disillusioned, Eddie nearly quit it all. "I was just so tired," he later admitted. "Tired of the bright lights, tired of pretending that I wasn't breaking into pieces inside." But when he thought about all the years of hunger, the friends who had left the band, and the millions of people who still believed in their music, he knew he couldn't just walk away. "If we gave up now," he told Walter Williams, "then what did all that pain we went through even mean?" And so he stayed. By 1987, at 45 years old, Eddie Levert roared back with a new album called Let Me Touch You, which soared straight to #1 on Billboard's R&B chart. For a little while, the whole world was dancing to his music again, completely unaware that he was often singing through a fog of painkillers and pure adrenaline. Between the late 1980s and the early 2000s, the OJs earned over 10 gold albums, toured sold-out arenas across several continents, and built a fortune that would one day be worth more than $20 million. "We started with nothing," Eddie said. "We built everything we have from faith and hard work." Yet even with all that success, he knew in his heart that the price of glory had never gone down. "People think that success makes you free," he told an interviewer years later. "But sometimes success just makes your cage a little bigger and a little nicer." The applause kept getting louder, but so did the fatigue. The stage lights still burned hot. But somewhere behind that golden smile, fate was already waiting patiently for its next turn. When the OJs were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2005, Eddie was 63 years old. He stood beneath the spotlights that had once felt so unreachable, holding a microphone that had both fed his family and scarred his soul. The audience cheered wildly for him, but his eyes glistened with something much deeper than pride. "I thought of my parents," he said afterward. "I thought of every single night I went to bed hungry. It was never about the money. It was about surviving long enough for the world to finally hear us." The spotlight burned brighter than it ever had before, and beneath it, Eddie smiled. It was the kind of smile that only a true survivor knows how to wear. For a little while, it seemed as if he had outrun every storm that life had sent his way. But some storms don't fall from the sky. They rise from within a person's own life. The crowd heard his songs, only he knew what those songs had truly cost him. And from that moment on, every note he sang carried both his triumph and a quiet, desperate prayer that the music would somehow outlive all the pain. He had sung for millions of people, but the silence that was waiting for him at home was the loudest song he would ever have to hear. The stage lights were still burning in his eyes as he stepped into the darkness of his empty house. A house that had once overflowed with the laughter of a family, now echoed with the quiet, heavy weight of distance. She was the woman who had walked beside him when he had absolutely nothing, and the one he simply couldn't hold on to when he finally had it all. Martha Bird Levert wasn't just his wife. She was the witness to every bruise, every prayer, every single note that had built the man the world would later cheer for. They had met in the early 1960s, when Eddie was still just a dreamer wearing a second-hand suit, singing in smoky clubs around Canton, Ohio. Martha saw him not for what he was at that moment, but for what he knew he could become. They married in 1966, two young hearts chasing one single rhythm, their pockets empty but their souls completely full. Their first home together was small and drafty, its wallpaper peeling and the heater groaning loudly through the harsh Ohio winters. But their laughter made it feel warm and alive. Every morning she would hum old hymns while he practiced his vocal scales. Every night he would whisper new song lyrics to the baby that was growing inside her. When their son Gerald was born later that year, Eddie wept tears of joy, promising his newborn son that his voice would build a better world for him. 2 years later, along came Sean, a wild and bright little boy who seemed to dance before he could even walk properly. "Those were the happiest years of my life," Eddie once said. "We didn't have any money, but we had our music and we had each other, and that was always enough." But success, he learned, is a cruel trade. It takes exactly what it wants in exchange for everything you thought you could keep. By 1972, the OJs had become a national phenomenon. Tours, interviews, long flights. His calendar was packed, but his house was increasingly empty. "The road that gave me everything," Eddie would admit later, also took me away from them. Martha stayed at home with their 2 growing boys, holding the fort down while fame slowly took her husband further and further out of her reach. The phone calls between them grew shorter. His visits home became rarer and rarer. He would come home at 3 in the morning, still smelling of stage smoke and the roar of applause, and he would find Martha asleep on the couch, the TV still glowing with a blue light, the boys' toys scattered across the floor. Fame was feeding his dream, but it was starving his family. "We stopped fighting," he said. "Not because we stopped caring for each other, but because silence became our new language." Their last night together as a family wasn't filled with shouting or anger. It was just the sound of rain tapping softly against the window, and 2 people slowly realizing that they had become strangers living in the same house. When he left, he took only a single suitcase and his guitar. The rest of it, the laughter, the family, the warmth, stayed behind with her. They had been married for nearly 2 decades, long enough to build a world of dreams together and then break under their immense weight. The divorce papers came quietly, without lawyers or any kind of spectacle. "The papers said divorce," Eddie later said. "But what I lost wasn't just a marriage. It was my entire family. The house, the gold records, all the memories, they stayed with her." He kept the songs. The children lived mostly with Martha, while Eddie buried himself in the only place that still made any sense to him, the recording studio. "I thought I could fix everything with money," he admitted years later. "But all they really wanted from me was my time." He often spoke of Martha with a quiet tenderness that never seemed to leave his eyes. "She saw me before the rest of the world ever did," he said. "She believed I could fly long before I ever had my own wings." He said the same thing about his sons, especially Gerald, who began to sing before he could even read. Eddie would lift him up onto his shoulders and whisper, "One day, you're going to sing even louder than me." He didn't know then, in those happy moments, how tragically true those words would one day become. The day he finally moved out, little Gerald ran after his car, waving a toy microphone in his tiny hand. Eddie watched him in the rearview mirror until his son's small figure disappeared from sight. It was a vision that would haunt him for decades. "Every song I ever wrote after that," he said, "was me trying to find my way back to that moment, to hold on to my family for just a little bit longer." He thought that losing the love of his wife was the worst pain a man could ever feel. But life was far from done testing the strength of his heart. In the years to come, the silence that began in his marriage would echo through his very soul. Yet, even as the world kept demanding his voice, somewhere far away in a small Ohio window, a single light kept burning through the night, a quiet reminder of the home, the woman, and the love he never, ever stopped missing. He was 63 years old when love dared to knock on his door again. A full 20 years after his first marriage had quietly ended in the wreckage of fame and silence. By 2005, Eddie Levert had already lived a lifetime's worth of both triumph and tragedy. He had known the incredible roar of sold-out arenas and the unbearable quiet of an empty home. He had buried dear friends, watched his sons grow into men, and carried the heavy guilt of a husband who had learned too late what love truly costs. He wasn't looking for redemption anymore, only for a little rest. But then came Raquel Captain, a woman whose calm and steady presence would turn his rest into healing, and that healing into a second chance at love. They met at a time when the world had stopped expecting Eddie Levert to ever fall in love again. Raquel didn't come into his life to fix him. She came to gently remind him that even broken things can still hold a beautiful light. She was soft-spoken, deeply spiritual, and incredibly patient, the kind of patience that is forged from a person's own life scars. She was very intelligent, very human, and very close to God, Eddie would later say. "She gave me a peace inside that I had never known before." For the first time in decades, he began to laugh again, not the big stage laugh that could fill a stadium, but the quiet, genuine kind that comes out only when you feel truly safe. When they married that same year, it wasn't a big, flashy celebrity affair. It was simply 2 souls exchanging promises, not to be perfect, but to simply stay together. Their love grew not from giant fireworks, but from small, ordinary mornings. Eddie would wake up early, humming old OJ's melodies as the coffee brewed. Raquel would tease him gently about still rehearsing after more than 60 years in the music business. "Habit," he'd grin back at her. "Old habits that remind me I'm still alive." Their daughter, Ryan, who was born in 2002 before their marriage, was the golden thread that stitched this beautiful new chapter of his life together. Eddie was older now, more tender, more patient, more painfully aware of how quickly time was slipping through his fingers. He'd braid Ryan's hair while Raquel packed her school lunches, or he would sit by her bed at night, telling her stories about when her big brothers were little. The house, once haunted by the echoes of his past, now pulsed with the sounds of laughter and gospel music once again. "This time," Eddie once said, "I didn't want to just be the singer in the family. I wanted to be there when the song ended." But even a love that heals can still ache. Touring still called his name. The stage was both his greatest blessing and his oldest curse. There were nights when Raquel waited alone by the phone, praying that his heart, already so weary from years of pain, would hold up under the hot, bright lights. There were arguments between them, born not from anger but from a deep-seated fear. She didn't marry the legend, he later admitted. She married the man, and that man was still learning how to stay in one place. Yet through it all, Raquel never once walked away. When he grew silent and withdrawn, she would simply pray beside him. When he doubted himself, she would remind him, "Love isn't a song you perform just once. It's a song you have to practice every single day." As the years passed, their bond deepened into something quieter, wiser, almost sacred. They built a life together between Las Vegas and Ohio, a careful balance of glamour and beautiful simplicity. Eddie, once so restless, now found real joy in stillness, cooking dinner, feeding the dog, tending to the backyard garden under the warm desert sun. He often said that his real standing ovation came every single night when Raquel would smile at him from across the dinner table. "I used to think that love was what the world gave you," he told a close friend. "But Raquel taught me that it's really about what you choose to give back." Everywhere he went, people still asked him about his greatest hits. Love Train, For the Love of Money, Backstabbers. But the real music, he insisted, played at home now, in the quiet rhythm of his new family's laughter. "I had to lose everything," Eddie reflected, "to finally learn how to love someone the right way." In Raquel's eyes, he found not the blinding glare of the spotlight, but a much gentler glow, the kind that doesn't fade away when the curtains finally fall. And in his daughter Ryan's laughter, he heard the sweetest encore of all. It was proof that love, when it is given a second chance, can still sound a lot like grace. There are some pains that the human heart was never meant to feel, wounds so deep that they echo for an entire lifetime. The very worst of them all is a parent having to bury their own child. For Eddie Levert, that unthinkable moment arrived on November 10th, 2006, when the brightest voice in his world was suddenly silenced. Gerald Levert wasn't just Eddie's eldest son. He was his reflection, his echo, his rhythm, his deepest pride. Born on July 13th, 1966 to Eddie and Martha Bird Levert, Gerald had music flowing through his blood before he could even speak his first word. He was the little boy who would fall asleep backstage, curled up in a chair in the glow of the stage lights while his father's powerful voice filled the empty concert halls. "He used to sit right behind the curtain," Eddie once said, "mouthing every single word I sang, like he already knew all the lyrics before I even did." That little boy grew into a man who didn't just inherit his father's gift. He magnified it, made it his own. By the 1980s, Gerald had become a musical storm of his own. His smile could light up an entire room. His voice, a mix of pure velvet and thunder, could move complete strangers to tears. He was the living, breathing proof that soul music runs in the family. But to Eddie, he was still just my boy. The kid who called him every single morning, the one who'd say, "Hey Pops, you still working those old school dance moves?" They teased each other, they argued sometimes, they prayed together, and they always shared a laugh before walking out on stage together. Their famous duet, "Baby Hold On to Me," wasn't just a song. It was their shared heartbeat recorded for all time, a father's immense pride meeting a son's boundless promise. During that recording session, the producer remembered seeing Eddie turn away from the microphone, his eyes wet with tears as Gerald sang the line, "Whatever you do, don't let go." That wasn't just a lyric in a song, Eddie said later. That was him talking directly to me. But the higher a person climbs, the thinner the air becomes. Fame demanded more from Gerald than any human being could possibly give. Endless tours, sleepless nights, a never-ending cycle of interviews, airports, and pure exhaustion. Eddie saw the tiredness in his son's eyes, but he told himself it was just the normal fatigue of the business. "He had my fire inside him," Eddie said, "but I forgot that he didn't have my years of experience to handle it." Then came that cold Friday morning in Las Vegas. Eddie woke up early, the desert light just beginning to crawl through his bedroom curtains. The phone rang and he saw Gerald's name flashing on the screen. He smiled as he answered, "Morning, son." But it wasn't his son's familiar booming voice on the other end. It was a voice that was shaking, barely able to form the words. "Eddie? He's gone." 2 words. 2 words that ended his entire universe. He dropped the phone. It hit the floor and shattered, and he felt something shattered deep inside of him too. He swore that even the clocks in the house stopped ticking at that very moment. Across town, Martha Bird collapsed to her knees, clutching a framed photo of their son. 2 parents once bound by their love, now bound together again by a grief that was too large to comprehend. The world found out just a few hours later. Radio hosts broke down in the middle of their sentences. Fans had to pull their cars over to the side of the road when they heard the news. Singers who had once shared the stage with Gerald could only post one single word on their social media. Why? The very air itself seemed heavier that day. Gerald was only 40 years old. The coroner's report would later call it a lethal combination of prescription and over-the-counter medications. But for Eddie, medical labels meant absolutely nothing. "You spend your whole life trying to protect your children," he said, "and then one day the world takes them away from you anyway." The funeral came far too soon, feeling too surreal to be real. The church was overflowing, a sea of black suits and utterly broken hearts. On the casket lay a single gold microphone and a photo of the father and son, frozen in a moment of mid-laughter. A gospel choir began to hum the melody of "Baby, Hold On to Me." No one sang the lead vocal. The crowd just wept the melody instead. Eddie stood at the front of the church, his whole body trembling, his hands gripping the wooden pew so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He tried to sing along, but no sound would come out. The man whose voice had once lifted the spirits of millions now had no voice left for his own sorrow. They say that there is no word in any language for a parent who loses a child, because no language could ever hold that kind of pain. When the service finally ended, a beam of sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting Gerald's name in gold across the church floor. For a brief, fleeting moment, Eddie looked up toward the light and whispered, "You did it, son. You made heaven sing." In the weeks that followed, life lost all its shape and meaning for Eddie. He drifted through the rooms of his house, which now felt far too quiet. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. The radio still played Gerald's songs, and each note felt like it was carving a new wound in his heart. "People told me I should be proud of what he accomplished," he said later. But pride doesn't help you when your house is so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. Some nights he would sit alone in the dark, rewinding old tapes just to hear Gerald's laughter in between the takes. "That laugh of his," he said, "that was my favorite song he ever sang." Other nights he would wake up from a deep sleep, thinking he heard his son's voice in the next room. "For just 1 second I'd forget he was gone," he whispered. And that was the cruelest part of all. Months later he made himself return to the stage. The crowd rose to their feet before he even sang a single note. He held the microphone in his hand for a long time, his head bowed low as if he was waiting for another voice to join his. Then he began to sing "A Baby, Hold On to Me." His voice cracked on the very first line. Halfway through the song he had to stop. He simply couldn't go on. The audience, seeing his pain, finished the song for him. Thousands of voices, all carrying the chorus that his heart could not. That night, Eddie finally understood what true grief was. "It's like singing a song that you can't ever finish," he said. "But you keep trying to sing it anyway, just to feel close to them again." Now, even years later, he still talks to his son before every single show. He keeps a photo of Gerald in his guitar case, his laughter safe in his memory, his spirit alive in every breath he takes. "He's still here with me," Eddie says softly. "Every time I sing, I can hear him harmonizing with me from somewhere much higher." And sometimes, when the crowd falls completely silent and the stage lights dim to black, Eddie swears he can hear that familiar booming laugh echoing from backstage. The same laugh that once filled his entire world. The kind of laugh that makes you believe deep down in your soul that maybe real love doesn't ever die, it just changes rooms.